Yeah, when I started working it was little brother typewriters, and you'd have 3 bits of paper in and 3 copies of the story. I worked in a newspaper office initially. I worked in newspapers for almost 20 years. And you know, when you went to work, you smelled the ink of the printer. You know, it smelt like a newspaper. It was a newspaper. Of course, everyone smoked. Well, I didn't, but most people smoked, so it was full of smoke. And I think actually it was after about a year or 2 I was there that we managed to make our newsroom smoke-free before the legislation came in. So it was a real newspaper, a local newspaper serving, you know, the province. This was in Nelson, and of course the changes since then have just, you know, light years difference in terms of obviously the technology, computerisation. You know, you don't have printing works with the newspapers anymore. They're cited elsewhere, and but since then I've moved into radio and more technology. And the web, I mean, the web has just changed the way, not so much the way journalism is done, or in some ways it has, although there's question marks about whether some of those changes are for the better or not. But you know, the way that the different platforms now that you can use to get stories out, but also the pressure now, even greater pressure on journalists, that everything has to be instant at this moment, because the web can take it now. You're not waiting for a deadline for tomorrow's paper or for the afternoon edition. So that's put a whole lot of pressures on journalism, and again, sometimes not for the best, because people are, you know, they rush to get a story out, and at times they're probably better to take a bit more time to get a bit more context, to get it, make sure they've got it right. So, you know, a whole lot of changes, and putting a lot more pressure, I think, actually on journalists to deal with a lot more different technologies, and to deal with a lot more of that immediate pressure to get the story out. Yeah, I think the media in general, but particularly newspapers, were, yeah, I'm not sure about the word powerful, but influential. You know, people read the newspapers, so they carried the news of the day, whether it was in the cities or provincial towns, and so they are very important in people's lives. Nowadays, of course, people can get everything off their smartphone, and they don't have to necessarily be following what we would call, I guess, or what they call mainstream media or traditional news media. People are following friends on Facebook who might be telling them about what's going on. You know, Twitter, people tweeting all sorts of things. Of course, the thing about that is there's no sense of whether it's right or wrong, and I think that's why journalism is still so important in terms of being what it should be, a credible and reliable source of information which makes sense of this complete mess and massive information that's thrown at people now. But there's no doubt there's huge challenges for news media organisations, for newspapers, radio, television stations and their websites to ensure that they remain relevant and credible to their listeners, their readers, their viewers. I think if I knew where they were going, I could probably make myself a pretty rich man. It's pretty hard to tell. I remember being at a conference probably 8 years ago, international conference in Spain, about the future of journalism, and a speaker from the United States called John Nichols got up and told everyone then that, look, don't worry about PCs and tablets. Everything is going to be on the smartphone, and that media organisations have to be completely focused on delivering news to smartphones. And there was quite a lot of debate at the time, and a number of people, nah. Well, of course, probably within a year or two, he was absolutely right. What's going to take that out? What's going to replace that? I don't know. I mean, and that's, I think, the biggest problem in a way, or challenge for journalism is that you don't really know what's going to be the next technological development and where it's going to take us, and the pressures it'll put on journalism in order to, you know, to get its message across. I mean, the thing that most media organisations have to be is just nimble and flexible enough to respond as quickly as possible to delivering news on that platform where people want it. But equally though, I think we've got to say, let's not just though suddenly dismiss and abandon everything we've done. I mean, if you look at the newspaper industry, yes, struggling, but their profit still comes from newspapers. No one has yet really produced a credible alternative in terms of a commercial model in the commercial media to make money yet out of what they do on the web. I think they're starting to move towards that way. And again, for radio, while all got websites, but still, radio listenership is ebbing away. But still, a lot of people still listen to the radio. So you can't abandon those old forms of delivering news and journalism. You've got to maintain them and maintain their quality while you're shifting and adapting to these new forms of technology. With all of the social media development, there's this idea now that people talk about the citizen journalist. That's a great title used, and there's a degree of truth in that. But we've always had citizen journalists. There've always been people. The thing that I think journalists forget is we always rely on people telling us stuff. Now actually people can actually video it on their phone and all of that, and actually send us that video rather than just give us an eyewitness account of something. I can't really help on what would really surprise me out of that would really disrupt journalism now. I mean, I can't imagine how it can be any more disrupted than it is at the moment, to be honest. Well, I think internationally and the debate internationally around the future of journalism and how it responds to what we've been talking about, the sort of really the disruption that's caused by new technology, is absolutely around that. The fundamental importance of ethical, principled journalism to democracy, and that is what I guess we in the international community of journalists believe is kind of the saving grace for journalism. That without that level of journalism, that societies, democracies really can't be as healthy in as healthy shape as they should be. And so that if people are interested in their communities and in their democracy, they would support quality journalism. And that's the big thing, though. It's around quality ethical journalism. And I think the worry that certainly in a number of conferences I've gone to where this matter's been discussed, the worry has been that a number of media organisations are responding to the challenges by going to the lowest common denominator. And I think the one thing that a number of us agree on is, that's not good for journalism. It's not good for the democracies that we live in, and for the emerging democracies. And eventually, ultimately, we don't believe it's actually good for the companies themselves. I mean, that they won't survive that way. The way that you'll survive and prosper and thrive in this environment is to provide that quality independent journalism that makes sense of what's happening in your community, in your country and in the world, in a way that most of the chatter on social media does not. And so that it is journalism, that it's not just running your opinions as many of the social media sort of outlets do, and that people can trust what they read, that it is as accurate and as truthful and as fair and as balanced as it possibly could be. They should be. I mean, they absolutely should be, because in all Western democracies, democracy as we understand it is being undermined. And it's being undermined because we probably don't have as an independent and as credible media as we should, and in the sense that most governments of the day have massive kind of spin machines behind them. And now, of course, using social media, they are massaging the message even more. And so that makes it even more imperative that you do have an independent journalism going on, which essentially looks, to uncover stuff that a government of the day doesn't want the public to know, that will give voice to those voices that might otherwise struggle to be heard. So incredibly important, but and again, that's where the media has to play its part by ensuring that it does provide that independent, credible, quality journalism, so that people absolutely then do see it as necessary. I think one of the problems, when you look at polls, is that there's quite a lot of public, I guess, disquiet about the news media. A sense of, oh, well, they don't tell us these things correctly or accurately, they're not independent. So, and to be honest, there's probably a degree of, rationale, they've got reason to believe that, because, too often the news media is perhaps being a bit sensationalist, they're trying to draw an audience, and therefore, and they're not, in my view, certainly here in New Zealand, covering issues in the way consistently that we should. Too often in politics, for instance, it's about the game of politics. It's not about the issues that affect people's lives. It's not about, looking deeply enough at the legislation that's going to affect how you and I live our lives. And so I think that's what makes people both cynical about the media and cynical about politics. And that's driven by both how the politicians operate and how the media report that. Well, it needs strong leadership, that puts, as I said, quality, ethical journalism first. That doesn't just basically cater for the sort of clickbait approach to media, what's most interesting to people, what are people, because if you go back to the tabloid papers, that's why they had a page 3 girl. Because they told them that, how a lot of male readers, love to see a page 3 girl. Well, that's not journalism, we know that. And now the danger is with social media, that whole clickbait thing of, what sort of, whichever celebrity is in the news at the time and people's interest in their personal life, that becomes the focus of journalism. Well, that's not really journalism. And I'm not saying there's not a place for human interest stories and for offbeat stories and for celebrity stories, but not as the core of what we do. So I think it does take a real strength of character and a real commitment to that principled, public service journalism. So journalism that's in the public interest, not necessarily so much always that the public's interested in, the sort of prurient stuff, and a real commitment to that, and a commitment to doing it well, so that it is interesting and it is credible and it is relevant to people's lives. There's no point doing something that's nice and worthy but boring. I understand that. But I think if most media organisations and newsroom leaders think about it, the stories we're talking about, and look, a story, climate change, and I know because I've seen it, a lot of people's eyes in newsrooms can glaze over about climate change, because when you start talking about CO2 emissions and tonnes, etc., but that story is essentially quite a simple one, and and if people look at it in a simple way, about scientists agree that the atmosphere is warming because of what we are doing as humans, and that the consequences of that are going to be pretty dire, not just actually for low-lying Pacific Island states, but for all of us. And we should be telling that story, and we should be telling that story in a way that is relevant to people's lives, so that they take interest, because it is about their lives of their children and grandchildren. So it does take a commitment, and I know that. I've been in debates in newsrooms about how we cover stories, and often newsroom leaders can go for the easy option and the lowest common denominator, and I think that's got to change. And internationally, we do have leadership from groups like the International Federation of Journalists and others. There's a Global Editors Network as well, which is working to promote the whole thing about ethical journalism, because I think a lot of people recognise that it's by maintaining high standards of journalism, that's how journalism will thrive and survive, not by lowering those standards.